Triumph in the Mud, the Battle of Agincourt. The mud of Picardy had turned crimson by sunset on October 25, 1415, when 6,000 exhausted English soldiers, many battling dysentery and surviving on rainwater, achieved the impossible against France's mightiest army. King Henry V, the former playboy prince turned warrior king, had somehow transformed his rain-soaked, starving men into an unstoppable force that would decimate the cream of French nobility. The Battle of Agincourt wasn't just another medieval skirmish. It was the moment when traditional warfare died in the mud, when French chivalry met English pragmatism, and when a young king's audacious gamble changed the course of European history. This is not just a tale of arrows and armor, but a story of transformation. How a band of desperate men, outnumbered 4-1, trapped deep in enemy territory, turned their very disadvantages into weapons. While French nobles spent the night before battle boasting about who would capture which English lord, Henry's archers were sharpening stakes and praying they'd live to see England again. By the time the sun set the next day, those same nobles would learn a brutal lesson about the changing nature of warfare, one written in blood and mud by common English bowmen who dared to challenge the established order of battle. The transformation of Prince Henry into King Henry V. The taverns of London whispered about Prince Henry's wild nights long before they sang of his victories. As a teenager, he prowled Eastcheap's shadowy streets with a band of rogues, drinking deeply and brawling freely, while his father, King Henry IV, lay sick with worry both for his son and his controversially won crown. When a drunken Prince Henry allegedly struck Chief Justice William Gascoigne for arresting one of his companions, the judge had the audacity to jail the heir to the throne, an act that surprisingly earned the prince's lifelong respect rather than his vengeance. Yet beneath the carousing exterior lay a calculating mind. While his father battled rebellions to defend his usurped throne, young Henry was learning warfare in Wales against the brilliant guerrilla tactician Owain Glyndwr. Each defeat taught him more than his victories. By age 16, he had taken an arrow to the face in the Battle of Shrewsbury, a wound that would have killed a lesser man, and was commanding armies with a veteran's insight. The scar that remained would become his badge of transformation, marking the death of the wild prince and the birth of a warrior king. This metamorphosis crystallized in 1413, when Henry IV finally succumbed to his illness. The court held its breath, expecting the new King Henry V to fill his father's throne with debauchery. Instead, he shocked them all by summoning his old drinking companions and banishing them from his presence. "I am not the man I was," he declared, and set about proving it. He released political prisoners, sought counsel from former enemies, and began meticulously planning something that would either secure his place in history or end his reign before it truly began: the conquest of France. With England still bleeding from decades of civil war, many thought Henry mad to even consider such an ambitious campaign. But the young king had inherited more than just his father's crown. He had inherited an ancient claim to the French throne through his great-grandfather Edward III, and an even greater claim through strategic opportunity. France was tearing itself apart in a civil war between the Burgundians and Armagnacs, while its king, Charles VI, regularly lost himself to bouts of insanity. Henry didn't just see a chance for conquest, he saw divine providence. In his mind, God himself had arranged this perfect moment for England to reclaim her rights across the Channel. By the spring of 1415, he had convinced his parliament, gathered his army, and set his sights on the crown that would either make him a legend or destroy him completely. The die was cast. The only question remaining was whether this reformed prince had truly transformed into the king England needed him to be. Henry The's perilous path to Picardy. On August 11, 1415, Henry's grand vision nearly died in Southampton before it began. As his invasion fleet prepared to sail, the king learned of a plot to murder him and place Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, on the throne. 3 noble conspirators, Lord Scrope, Sir Thomas Grey, and Henry's own cousin Richard of Cambridge, had accepted French gold to end the invasion before it started. Henry's response was swift and merciless. Within days, the conspirators' heads adorned London Bridge, a stark message about the price of treachery. Rather than deterring him, the plot seemed to harden Henry's resolve. 2 days later, he led his fleet of 1,500 ships out of Southampton, their white sails catching the late summer breeze. The Siege of Harlur was meant to be a quick victory. Instead, it became a nightmare. For 5 weeks, Henry's army battled not just French defenders, but an invisible enemy far more lethal: dysentery. The bloody flux swept through the English camps, carried by contaminated water and worsened by the summer heat. Men who had arrived strong and confident now lay weak in their own filth, their bodies racked by fever and dehydration. When Harlur finally fell on September 22nd, Henry had lost nearly a third of his army not to French swords, but to disease. The prudent choice would have been to return to England with this single victory. Instead, he made what appeared to be a suicidal decision: to march his weakened army across enemy territory to Calais. What followed was a desperate 260-mile gamble through hostile French countryside. Henry's men trudged through autumn rains carrying heavy weapons and armor, surviving on foraged food and what little clean water they could find. French cavalry harassed their flanks while larger forces gathered ahead, blocking river crossings and forcing the English army into ever more treacherous positions. At one point, running dangerously low on supplies, Henry offered to surrender Harlur and pay for damages in exchange for safe passage. The French, sensing blood in the water, refused. They had trapped the English army north of the Somme River, their nobles already dividing up the expected ransoms of captured knights and arguing over who would have the honor of capturing the English king. By October 24th, the trap was complete. Near the village of Agincourt, a massive French army blocked the road to Calais. Henry's exhausted men, their numbers reduced to around 6,000, faced at least 20,000 French troops fresh for battle. That night, as rain poured from leaden skies, French nobles celebrated their assured victory, while in the English camp, soldiers made their peace with God. Few expected to see another sunset. Yet in the mud and darkness, Henry moved among his men, sharing their meager rations and speaking not of death, but of the glory that awaited them. Tomorrow would bring either total destruction or immortal fame. There would be no middle ground. Agincourt, a battlefield of strategy and chaos. Dawn broke grey and sullen over Agincourt on October 25th, revealing a battlefield that seemed designed by the devil himself. Recent rains had turned the freshly plowed fields into a quagmire of sticky clay soil. Between 2 dense woodlands lay a natural funnel, barely 1,000 yards wide. Where most commanders would see disaster, Henry saw opportunity. His men quickly drove sharpened stakes into the ground at an angle, creating a deadly forest of wooden spikes. Behind these, his archers waited with their mighty longbows, each capable of punching through plate armor at 200 yards. The English battle line formed in an unconventional wedge, with dismounted men-at-arms in the center and archers on the wings, their positions making the narrow field even narrower. Across the muddy expanse, the French army assembled in a display of medieval might that would have struck terror into any normal foe. Their vanguard alone outnumbered the entire English army. Thousands of mounted knights in gleaming armor formed the wings, while the center bristled with men-at-arms and crossbowmen. The French nobles, resplendent in heraldic surcoats and newly polished armor, jostled for positions of honor in the front ranks. They had spent the night drinking wine and bragging about their imminent victory, many gambling on who would capture the highest-ranking English prisoners. Their horses' hooves churned the wet earth, creating a morass that would soon prove lethal. For 3 hours, the armies faced each other in tense stillness. The French, expecting the English to attack, waited in their increasingly uncomfortable armor. Henry used this time to his advantage, allowing his men to eat, rest, and strengthen their defenses. Finally, realizing the English wouldn't move, the French commanders faced a critical decision. Their initial plan, to wait for reinforcements and more heavy cavalry, warred with their pride and impatience. The sight of Henry's small force, seemingly cowering behind wooden stakes, proved too tempting. At 11 a.m., the French marshal raised his baton, and the greatest cavalry force in Europe began to move forward. What followed was a scene that would have been comical if it hadn't been so deadly. The French knights, packed shoulder to shoulder in the narrow field, could barely maneuver. Their horses, already unsettled by the wet ground, began to slip in the mud. Henry waited until they were within range, then gave a single command that would change the course of military history. 10,000 arrows darkened the sky, their bodkin points designed specifically to penetrate armor. The first volley alone killed hundreds of horses, creating chaos as the wounded animals thrashed and reared, throwing their riders and blocking those behind them. The deadly rain continued, turning the charge into a slaughter before it could even reach the English lines. The great French cavalry, pride of European chivalry, had been rendered obsolete in minutes by English yeomen with 6-foot bows. The Battle of Agincourt, death before dishonor. In the moments before the battle's decisive phase, Henry V delivered words that would echo through centuries. Riding along his line on a small grey horse, his golden crown glinting atop his battle helmet, he responded to a wish for more men with what became known as the St. Crispin's Day Speech. "The fewer men, the greater share of honor," he declared, promising that every man who fought that day would stand shoulder to shoulder with nobility in England's memory. Shakespeare would later immortalize this moment, but the actual words recorded by chroniclers struck deep into English hearts. Those who survived would spend their lives showing their scars and telling their sons of the day they fought with Harry at Agencourt. The French vanguard, having witnessed their cavalry's destruction, pressed forward on foot. 3,000 men-at-arms, led by dukes and counts in elaborate armor, advanced through their own dead and wounded. The muddy ground, already churned by horses and littered with casualties, clung to their leg armor. Each step became a battle against the earth itself. Their back ranks, eager for glory, pushed forward, compressing the formation until men could barely lift their weapons. The mass of armored warriors moved like a steel tide toward the English line, but their very numbers became their undoing. Men began to fall, not from arrows, but from suffocation as the press of bodies became too great. What happened next defied all medieval military convention. Henry's archers, having exhausted their arrows, cast aside their bows and charged into the struggling French formation with mallets, hatchets, and daggers. Lightly armoured and unencumbered by the mud, they moved like wolves among cattle. The French knights, compressed in their heavy armour, could barely swing their swords. Many toppled face first into the mud, where they drowned in their own helmets or were dispatched by English daggers seeking gaps in their armour. The archers, considered low-born rabble by the French nobility, proved that a hatchet in the hand of a common man could kill a duke as easily as a peasant. In a final desperate gambit, the French rear guard surged forward. The English line buckled but held. Then word reached Henry that French raiders had attacked his baggage train, where the royal treasury and his personal belongings were kept. Fearing a rear assault and the possible freeing of French prisoners, Henry made the most controversial decision of the battle. He ordered the execution of his high-ranking captives, an act that violated every code of chivalric warfare. Even some of his own knights hesitated, but the king's word was law. The French nobles, who had woken that morning expecting to count their ransoms, met death in the mud of Agincourt, their golden spurs and fine armour worth nothing in their final moments. The tragedy and triumph of Agencourt. As the autumn sun climbed toward noon, the field of Agincourt became an open grave. French knights lay piled 3 deep in places, their magnificent armour transformed into death traps. The Duke of York, Henry's cousin, fell defending the king's banner, his body recovered later beneath a mountain of French dead. But for every English noble lost, dozens of French nobles perished. The Count of Marle, barely 18 years old, died leading a desperate charge through the mud. The Duke of Brabant, arriving late to the battle, was cut down before he could even don his armour properly. The Duke of Alençon, fighting his way through the chaos, nearly changed history when he struck Henry's crown with his sword, knocking a piece of it away before English axes brought him down. The battle degenerated into a series of savage personal combats. English archers, their clothes soaked in mud and blood, moved through the field with ruthless efficiency. They had learned to flip fallen French knights face down in the muck, finding gaps in their armour or simply leaving them to drown. The screams of trapped men mixed with the clash of steel and the squelch of footsteps in the churned earth. Some French warriors tore off their own armour in desperate attempts to escape, only to be run down by the increasingly confident English troops. The flower of French chivalry, which had awakened that morning ready to teach the English archers their place, was being systematically destroyed by those very same common soldiers. By mid-afternoon, the remaining French forces broke. Those who could fled, leaving behind their fallen comrades and centuries of military tradition. The final count revealed the magnitude of the disaster. Among the French dead lay 3 dukes, 8 counts, a viscount, an archbishop, 90 banners of nobility, and over 3,000 knights. The cream of an entire generation of French nobility had been wiped out in a single day. When the heralds counted the English dead, the numbers seemed impossible. Fewer than 100 had fallen, including just one notable nobleman, Edward, Duke of York. It was a victory so complete, so devastating, that even Henry's most optimistic prayers couldn't have imagined it. As night fell over Agencourt, English soldiers moved through the carnage, claiming ransoms and saying prayers for friend and foe alike. They found gold chains, jeweled sword hilts, and fine armor worth fortunes. The collected wealth of French nobility, now literally soaked into the mud of Picardy. Henry ordered Christian burial for the dead of both sides, but it would take days to clear the field. The French would later claim that God had abandoned them that day, but the English whispered a different truth. God hadn't abandoned France. He had simply chosen to fight for England. Victory and legacy. The Battle of Agincourt and its enduring impact. News of Agincourt reached London before Henry's army made it back to England. As the king's ships appeared on the horizon, the Thames erupted with celebration. Bells rang from every church tower, and citizens waded into the freezing water to carry their warriors ashore. Henry, ever conscious of image, refused to let his attendants carry his battle-dented armor and personal arms in the victory parade. Instead, he insisted these items be displayed prominently in St. Paul's Cathedral, silent witnesses to God's favour on that muddy field. The common English archer, long looked down upon by Europe's nobility, had become a figure of terror and legend. Their longbows, which took a lifetime to master and could pierce plate armour at 200 paces, had changed warfare forever. The political aftermath of Agincourt reshaped medieval Europe. The French nobility, devastated by their losses, fell into bitter infighting. The Burgundians, seeing their chance, allied with England. Within 5 years, Henry would secure the Treaty of Troyes, making him heir to the French throne and husband to Princess Catherine of Valois. The same French nobles who had once mocked the English bastard king now bowed before him in Paris. Yet Henry's greatest triumph contained the seeds of future tragedy. His untimely death in 1422 would leave his infant son, Henry VI, to inherit both kingdoms, a child king whose weakness would eventually lead to the Wars of the Roses and the loss of all his father had won. Agincourt's impact on warfare proved even more lasting than its political consequences. The battle marked the beginning of the end for heavily armoured cavalry and the chivalric ideal of warfare. Military commanders could no longer ignore the deadly effectiveness of common soldiers with proper training and equipment. The French would eventually create their own skilled archery units, but too late to save their old way of war. More profound was the psychological shift. Agincourt proved that small, well-led armies could triumph over vastly superior forces through discipline, technology, and tactical innovation. Every general who has since won against overwhelming odds, from Wellington at Waterloo to the defenders of Rorke's Drift, owes a debt to the lessons written in mud and blood on St. Crispin's Day, 1415. The battle's final gift to history was its myth-making power. Shakespeare's Henry V transformed an already remarkable victory into an immortal legend, his words giving voice to the universal soldier's experience. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," resonates as deeply today as it did when first performed. The real Henry might not have delivered those exact words before battle, but he understood something that all great leaders know. Victory begins in the hearts of men. On that cold October morning, he turned 6,000 exhausted soldiers into heroes, not through Shakespeare's poetry, but through his own indomitable will and strategic brilliance. In doing so, he gave England more than a military triumph. He gave her an enduring symbol of what determination and courage could achieve against any odds. Agincourt, a testament to courage and innovation. Modern archaeology has peeled back layers of myth to reveal even more extraordinary truths about Agincourt. Ground-penetrating radar and metal detection surveys have revealed mass graves that tell their own stories of that bloody day. Arrow points found embedded 6 inches deep in the soil demonstrate the terrifying power of the English longbow, each arrow hitting with the force of a modern handgun. Recent experiments with replica weapons showed that a skilled archer could loose up to 6 arrows in the time it took a crossbowman to shoot once, explaining the devastating effect of English volleys. The skeletons themselves reveal brutal trauma: crushed skulls from warhammers, puncture wounds from daggers, and the distinctive marks of arrows that punched through steel plate as if it were parchment. But perhaps the most fascinating discovery wasn't found in the soil of Picardy, but in the chronicles written months after the battle. French accounts, rather than diminishing their defeat, spoke with awe of the English archers who fought like demons and a king who seemed blessed by divine providence. The Burgundian chronicler Enguerrand de Monstrelet, no friend to the English cause, wrote of Henry's tactical genius with undisguised admiration. Even the Church struggled to explain how God could have allowed such a catastrophic defeat of Catholic French nobles by English heretics, leading to complex theological debates about divine favor and military prowess. The battle's outcome was so unexpected, so complete, that it required a fundamental reimagining of how God interacted with warfare itself. Agincourt endures not just as a military victory, but as a testament to the power of leadership, innovation, and desperate courage. Each generation finds its own meaning in the story. For some, it's a lesson in the folly of pride. For others, proof that technology and tactics can overcome overwhelming odds. But perhaps its greatest legacy lies in how it demonstrates that history's most pivotal moments often turn not on the decisions of the many, but on the courage and conviction of the few. In the mud of Agincourt, 6,000 exhausted men didn't just win a battle. They proved that the course of history itself can be changed by those who dare to defy impossible odds.